Welcome to another episode of Grammar is Power. In this third video on adjective clauses, you'll learn how to distinguish restrictive and non-restrictive modifiers and how to punctuate each of them. A restrictive modifier identifies a specific noun from a larger group. In this video, we'll focus on adjective clauses, but the same concept applies to appositive phrases and clauses. The first step is to identify the adjective or relative clause. Then check to see whether the information in the clause is necessary to restrict the noun in front of it to a specific person or thing. Here, the adjective clause identifies which specific man called the FBI, limiting the potential callers to one specific person. In this sentence, the relative clause identifies which specific bike was stolen, the one that was worth a small fortune, not the inexpensive one. And this relative clause narrows the potential large group of students in a class to the specific ones who receive the bonus points. Restrictive modifiers are also called essential modifiers because they are necessary, or essential, to restrict a group to a particular individual or subgroup in the case of plurals, as in this third example sentence. Non-restrictive, also called non-essential, modifiers do not identify a specific individual or subgroup from a larger set, so they only provide extra information. In the second sentence, the man happens to own a Mac. The type of machine he owns doesn't help identify him or why he called, so the adjective clause is non-restrictive. The former owner of the bicycle is extra information in the second sentence. The point of the sentence is that Gail stole a bike. The second sentence here focuses on the fact that the teacher gave some students bonus points. That those students who sat in the front row is extra information about them. Sometimes it could be challenging to determine whether a modifier is restrictive or non-restrictive. There may be some room for interpretation. However, punctuation rules can help you interpret other writers' ideas and express your own ideas more clearly. Because non-restrictive modifiers only provide extra information, we put commas around them. You can think of the commas as sort of mini parentheses that identifying interesting but non-essential information. Restrictive modifiers are essential, so there are no commas around them. Do you think the relative clause in this sentence is restrictive or non-restrictive? Don't use the presence or absence of commas as an indicator, since this is a practice sentence. It is essential to narrow down which puppy, the one she adopted, not the one she saw in the animal shelter. In the second sentence, the fact that the puppy was 8 weeks old is non-essential information, so there are commas on both sides. Follow the directions on the handout to identify the relative clauses and determine whether they are restrictive or non-restrictive. Who is the relative pronoun standing in for Jane and functioning as the subject in the adjective clause. Who has lost her watch doesn't restrict the antecedent Jane to a specific Jane, so we put commas on both sides of this non-restrictive clause. Which is the relative pronoun standing in for Raft and functioning as the subject in the adjective clause. The color of the raft is non-essential information, so we use commas on both sides. In the second adjective clause, that is the relative pronoun functioning as the direct object, standing in for the trip. Because the clause restricts the number of possible trips to the specific one in July, the clause is essential, so no commas. As I said, sometimes it can be challenging to determine whether the information is restrictive or non-restrictive. Maybe you think that which was a bright yellow helps identify which specific raft, as in the yellow raft, not the blue or the green one. When that and which are relative pronouns, the determination is simple. That is only for restrictive clauses, and which is only for non-restrictive clauses. Now you only need to analyze the information in clauses starting with who, whom, and whose. We'll conclude this topic with a quick review of the two types of dependent clauses you now know. All dependent clauses have a subject-verb combination. Adverb clauses function as adverbs, modifying verbs in another clause. They begin with subordinating conjunctions, and therefore sometimes they're called subordinate clauses. Adjective clauses function as adjectives, modifying the noun or pronoun in front of them. They begin with relative pronouns and relative adverbs, so they're also called relative clauses. This three-part video series focused on adjective clauses in depth. So let's review the adverb clauses. The independent clause in this sentence is, we napped and almost overslept. The first dependent clause here begins with the subordinated conjunction before and modifies napped, telling when. The second dependent clause begins with the subordinating conjunction as, and also tells when to the verb it follows, overslept. The third clause begins with the subordinating conjunction because and modifies failed, the verb in the adverb clause in front of it, telling why. Briefly review the list of subordinating conjunctions again. Time for a final concept check on this topic. Follow the directions on the handout to parse the sentence and correct punctuation errors. There's a lot going on in this sentence, so let's break it down by clause. First, the independent clause. Wanda steals his body, reanimates him, and creates a fictional world. Wanda is the subject of 3 compound verbs, all parallel with direct objects. This sentence opens with an adverbial clause, beginning with the subordinating conjunction after. Therefore, we need a comma. Flashback alert. Did you remember the comma at the end of the adverb clause? Here's a quick review of the patterns for commas with adverbial clauses. Back to our sentence. The next clause is adjectival. It begins with the relative pronoun which, standing in for body and functioning as a subject in this clause. It gives non-essential information about the body, so commas on both sides. Following this independent clause, we have an adjective clause, starting with the relative adverb where. This clause restricts the group of possible fictional worlds to a specific one, so no commas. Lastly, the sentence ends with an adverb clause that begins with the subordinating conjunction because and modifies create in the independent clause, telling why. When adverb clauses follow the independent clauses they modify, no comma. And that concludes this instructional video series on adjective clauses and their punctuation. Now you're ready to try the set of practice exercises for this unit.